She couldn't remember her name, but the dog beside her did, and it led her to the people who'd never stopped loving her. Each stop brought back a whisper, a scent, a hand held too long, and a memory that someone had fought hard to bury. Smiles greeted her like old songs, but one voice among them was singing just a little too sweet, a little too wrong. He held her hand with practiced care, guided her gently, while quietly stealing the pieces of her past like coins from a wishing jar. 10 faces from another life. 10 keys to a door someone never wanted opened again. And when it finally swung wide, she remembered the man who called himself a friend, and the night he took everything. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just looked him in the eyes. And asked why he was holding her husband's death certificate, with her own signature at the bottom. It all started with silence, not the peaceful kind you find on a front porch at dusk, but the kind that presses in like fog, thick and strange, wrapping around your mind until you can't remember what day it is, or even if the woman in the mirror has your name. She sat in the middle of a tidy little room with pale yellow curtains and a vase of plastic roses that hadn't been touched in weeks, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for someone to tell her who she was supposed to be. There were voices out in the hallway, soft, purposeful, half-whispers that always seemed to hush the moment she tried to listen, nurses perhaps, or volunteers, or maybe just echoes of conversations she couldn't remember having. But the only presence she truly felt was the weight at her feet, the warm, steady shape of a dog with cloudy eyes and a coat touched by time, whose every breath seemed to say, "I know who you are, even if you don't." They called her Ellen, at least, that's what was stitched on the label of her sweater, just beneath a tiny American flag and a laundry number she didn't understand, but she couldn't say whether it was her name or someone else's. She didn't recognize the room, the smells, the calendar with the wrong year on it, or the man who entered with a paper cup of pills and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He said his name was Jacob, and that he was her friend, someone who'd known her for years, someone who'd stayed when others didn't, someone who cared more than the rest, and something in his voice made her nod, because she didn't know how to disagree. He fed the dog a biscuit from his pocket, the kind with peanut butter in the middle, and looked down at her with something between pity and patience, asking gently, "Do you remember what today is?" But she didn't. She only remembered the sound of waves, maybe, or a porch swing creaking, or the scent of lemon pie baking somewhere far away, but as for today, it was just another empty square on a forgotten calendar. That night, after the nurse turned off the light and the hallway fell back into hush, Ellen sat in bed with the dog curled beside her like a shadow stitched to her side, and something stirred deep inside her, something aching, something old. She dreamt of running, barefoot, laughing, down a gravel path lined with sunflowers, a man calling her name just beyond the bend, his voice full of love and urgency. And when she awoke, the dog was staring at her with those sad, loyal eyes, as if asking her if she remembered. She didn't. But when she stood up that morning, slowly, the dog rose with her, tail low but wagging, and walked to the door like it was time. Time for what, she didn't know. But her hands, worn and unsure, found the leash with the cracked leather strap, and her feet carried her past Jacob, who looked up from his paper with mild surprise, and out into the morning that smelled like cut grass and second chances. They walked for 2 blocks, maybe 3, past hedges that needed trimming and sidewalks that sloped from age, and Ellen said nothing, but the dog tugged gently with purpose, as if retracing a path it had memorized when the world still made sense. It stopped in front of a small brick building with a crooked sign that read Maple Grove Library, and something, some flicker of emotion she couldn't name, tightened in her chest. Inside, the scent of old pages and floor wax hit her like a memory wrapped in a warm blanket, and the librarian, an elderly man with kind eyes and a cardigan full of pens, looked up and froze. "Ellen," he whispered, standing so fast his chair nearly tipped over behind him. "Good Lord. I thought you were gone for good." She stared at him, searching his face for answers she didn't yet know how to ask. "I'm sorry," she murmured, have we met?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached under the desk, pulled out a faded children's book with a cloth cover and trembling hands, and said, "Do you remember the voice that used to bring this story to life every Wednesday morning for 47 years? Ellen blinked at the book, at the drawing of a bear in a striped vest and a field of daisies, and for the first time in what felt like forever, her lips parted on a sound that was almost a laugh, almost. I think I might have read that one once, she said slowly, almost cautiously. The man smiled with something like awe. You didn't just read it, Ellen. You lived it. She looked down at the dog, who had sat beside her patiently, head tilted, watching her carefully. Somewhere inside her, a door had creaked open. Not wide, not yet, but just enough to let in the breeze. And as she left the library, still holding that worn old book against her chest, Jacob stepped from the corner where he'd been standing unnoticed, his eyes hard to read. That man, he said, as if trying to make a joke of it, he always did confuse fantasy with reality. But the dog's ears went flat. And Ellen turned to Jacob and asked, voice steadier than she expected, why didn't you tell me I used to read to children here? Well, Ellen, Jacob began, his voice weaving calm around each syllable like a shawl against a chill evening breeze, there are stories so sharp with sorrow that hearing them too soon might cut deeper than any of us can mend. His words hovered in the air, settling upon her shoulders with the gentle weight of responsibilities half remembered, and Ellen wondered if pain avoided was sometimes worse than pain confronted, because it lingered like a question left unanswered. Chastity, ever steady at her side, pressed a graying muzzle against Ellen's knee, as though reminding her that truth, however jagged, was safer than any silence Jacob might offer in its place. The morning stretched ahead, painted in quiet blues and golds, and Jacob suggested a short walk for fresh air, yet the dog pulled with purpose, guiding them beyond the manicured gardens of the care home toward streets where autumn leaves whispered beneath cautious footsteps. They passed houses with sagging porches, mailboxes leaning like old friends exchanging secrets, and Ellen felt ripples of recognition flutter against her ribs, timid yet insistent, like sparrows testing newly healed wings. At a faded brick home guarded by a red gate, Chastity halted, tail wagging in slow, deliberate circles, and Ellen sensed an echo of welcome pulsing from cracked paint and flower beds gone to seed. Before she could lift a hesitant hand to knock, the door swung wide, revealing a petite woman whose silver-streaked hair framed eyes brimming with sudden tears, and in a tremulous voice she breathed, "Mercy, Ellen, Mercy, after all this time you found your way back." The name Mercy trembled through Ellen's chest, and though it rang unfamiliar upon her tongue, it shimmered with the promise of belonging, like a long-misplaced photograph rediscovered in a dusty attic trunk. Mercy drew her inside, fingers trembling as they opened a photo album thick with summers at county fairs, Christmas mornings in matching sweaters, and one snapshot where Ellen held a blue ribbon beside a pie that seemed almost to glow beneath a July sun. In the corner of that photograph, scarcely visible behind the festivities, a younger Jacob lingered in shadow, his expression unreadable, as though silently guarding a secret the camera never meant to reveal. With a voice gentled by memory, Mercy explained that letters sent after Ellen's accident had returned unopened, and Jacob, who claimed to care, always insisted Ellen needed peace and distance from old companions. Ellen turned to Jacob, her surprise salted with unease, and asked why he had never spoken of Mercy or of any accident. Jacob replied with polished concern, saying fragile hearts sometimes crumble beneath the weight of too much yesterday. Before doubts could scatter into arguments, Chastity padded down a narrow hallway, stopping before a closed door whose brass knob bore fingerprints newly bright, and Mercy confessed the room had been locked for years until someone requested entry the previous month. The latch yielded to Ellen's trembling fingers, revealing a sunlit chamber lined with cedar chests and a single porcelain ballerina turning inside a music box, the melody aching with familiarity that coaxed unexpected tears to her lashes. Hidden beneath velvet lining, Ellen discovered an envelope addressed to Mercy in her own looping script, dated just 6 months prior, apologizing for silence she could not remember choosing and begging forgiveness she didn't understand needing. Mercy whispered that she never received that letter, and understanding sliced through Ellen's confusion. Someone had intercepted the message, perhaps to ensure Mercy would not search, perhaps to keep Ellen from being found at all. Jacob's voice thinned as he urged they return before fatigue claimed Ellen, yet Mercy, straightening with quiet authority, asked, "Who decided you alone should guard the gate to her memories?" For an instant a spark, sharp as flint, flickered in Jacob's eyes, then vanished behind the polite smile he restored, insisting he only wanted the best for Ellen, though his words seemed to echo in a room suddenly colder. Evening light stretched long shadows across the porch as Mercy pressed the music box into Ellen's hands, promising its song would steady her steps when recollections wavered, and Ellen felt the fragile weight of melody anchor itself near her heart. Turning to Jacob with a resolve she scarcely recognized as her own, Ellen asked whether he would truly help her uncover the next piece of her story, and Jacob lifted his hands in reluctant assent while Chastity tugged the leash with restless anticipation. Night gathered soft and slow, wrapping the world in shades of violet and deep indigo, and Ellen, strengthened by memory's faint pulse, looked down at her faithful companion and asked into the hush. "Where to next, old friend?" Ellen asked softly, her voice carrying just enough tremble to betray the uncertainty still curled inside her chest. Chastity looked up at her with eyes that bore more wisdom than any words a person could offer, then turned with quiet insistence down a street Ellen didn't recognize but somehow trusted. Jacob followed without a word, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, the faint click of his polished shoes tapping out a rhythm that didn't quite match the pace of her thoughts. They walked past houses wrapped in silence, past fences leaning tiredly into yards filled with rusted bicycles and wind chimes that hadn't stirred in weeks, until they reached a narrow lane with faded white stones pressed into the gravel like forgotten markers. At the end of the lane stood a small house with paint peeling at the corners and a willow tree bending low over the porch as if listening for the return of a story it hadn't heard in years. Chastity stopped at the gate and waited, not impatient, but firm, like she understood that this was a place where answers lived, even if those answers came with sorrow. Ellen hesitated, one hand on the gate, feeling the wood warm from the afternoon sun and oddly familiar beneath her fingers, like a memory buried just beneath the skin. The door opened before she could knock, and a woman with a voice like sweet tea and gravel said, "Well, I'll be. Ellen May Redding, you come home to me after all this time." Her name fell like rain on dry soil, soft, welcome, startling, and Ellen blinked at the woman, searching for recognition, until the sound of wind rustling the willow leaves pulled something loose in her mind. The woman, tall and broad-shouldered with laugh lines carved deep into her cheeks, introduced herself as Mabel Carter, a neighbor and once, according to her, the keeper of Ellen's oldest secrets. Mabel led them inside to a living room that smelled faintly of cinnamon and lavender, where photos of picnics, porch gatherings, and birthday cakes filled the walls like a museum of another lifetime. She pulled out a small wooden box from beneath the couch and handed it to Ellen, who opened it slowly, revealing a collection of pressed flowers, letters, and one silver locket with initials engraved in delicate looping script. Inside the locket was a picture of two girls, one unmistakably Ellen, younger and laughing, and the other a dark-haired child with wide eyes and a ribbon tied in a crooked bow. "That's Annie," Mabel said gently, settling beside her. "You raised her like your own when her mama passed. Do you remember how she used to braid your hair before church?" Ellen touched the locket with trembling fingers, the weight of it heavy not just with metal but with something far older, something aching to be remembered. I think I remember her hands," Ellen whispered, her voice fragile but honest. "She had warm hands, always warm." Mabel nodded, her eyes suddenly wet. "She never stopped writing to you, you know. Even after they said you weren't well enough to answer." Ellen turned to Jacob, whose expression remained unreadable, though his mouth tightened for the briefest moment before he glanced away toward the window. "She was the one who called me when you didn't show up that Christmas," Mabel continued, her voice carrying the weight of years. "Said something wasn't right. But Jacob said you were resting, said too many visitors made your condition worse." Chastity shifted beside the couch, letting out a low whine, not of discomfort, but of knowing, and Ellen felt something inside her twist, a question forming that had no clear shape but refused to be ignored. Mabel reached for the bundle of letters still tied with a faded pink ribbon and placed them in Ellen's lap, the paper soft with age and smudged with fingerprints too small to be Jacob's. Ellen opened the top letter and read aloud, just above a whisper, "Dear Miss Ellen, I miss you every day. I saved your favorite rock by the creek, and I think it misses you too." Her breath caught on the last word, and Mabel laid a hand over hers, not asking anything, just waiting with the patience of someone who knew healing had its own stubborn pace. Ellen turned to Jacob then, and though her voice remained calm, it held the quiet edge of resolve. "Why didn't you ever mention Annie?" Jacob's smile returned, polished, practiced, too smooth for a moment this raw, and he said, "Some things are best left behind, Ellen. Digging too deep can bring up more hurt than answers." But Ellen no longer feared the hurt, not when it led her back to names, to faces, to pieces of herself she thought forever lost. Before they left, Mabel reached into a drawer and pressed a yellowed postcard into Ellen's hand, one written in a child's messy scrawl, "Come find me when you remember the treehouse." Ellen stared at it long after the sun had dipped behind the willow branches, and when she finally looked up, her voice was quiet but clear. Where did she mean, the treehouse? She meant the one your husband built, just past the old river bend, before everything changed, before the storm took it all away, Mabel said softly, her words brushing against Ellen's heart like a gentle wind rustling through the memories she hadn't yet dared to reach. The name, husband, echoed inside Ellen's chest like a bell long silent, stirring something both tender and painful, a kind of love remembered only by the body when the mind forgets. Jacob cleared his throat then, as if trying to guide the moment back into safer territory, but the dog stood up first, her ears tilted toward the door, already knowing that their next step waited where laughter once lived in wood and sunlight. The ride to the river bend was slow, deliberate, quiet, the kind of quiet that carries more weight than words ever could, broken only by the sound of tires crunching over gravel and the occasional chirp of birds hidden in the trees. Ellen stared out the window as they drove, watching the familiar turnings of a world that had once belonged to her, recognizing curves in the road not by name but by the way they made her heart shift, almost like they were whispering, "You've been here before." Jacob kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel just a little too tightly, while Chastity pressed her head against Ellen's thigh, warm and steady as an old friend guarding her from the shadows still to come. When they reached the riverbank, the sun was sinking low across the water, scattering gold and rust over the surface, and for a brief moment, it looked exactly as it must have all those years ago. The treehouse was still there, leaning slightly, half swallowed by the branches of the tall oak, but unmistakable in its shape and presence, like a memory that refused to rot despite time and storms. Ellen stepped out of the car slowly, the scent of the river hitting her all at once, damp leaves, wet wood, and a hint of honeysuckle, and she felt her knees go soft beneath the weight of recognition. The stairs creaked as she climbed, each step feeling like a heartbeat, and at the top, she found an old green blanket folded in the corner, a mason jar filled with smooth river stones, and a child's drawing pinned to the wall with a rusty nail. The picture showed a woman and a dog sitting beside a treehouse, beneath a sky filled with stars, and in the corner were the words, "Me and Miss Ellen forever." She reached out, her fingers tracing the crayon lines like she was blessing them, and in that moment, a flash of something bright and whole lit up in her chest. Her laugh, once carried by the wind from that very place, came back to her in pieces. And then she saw it, tucked between the floorboards, hidden but not lost, a note, folded small and worn with time, addressed in familiar handwriting. "If you find this, it means you're remembering." Her hands trembled as she opened it, revealing a single sentence that broke her breath in two, "He's not who he says he is." Ellen stared at the words as her heart thudded slowly in her chest, like a drum calling up an old warning from the past, something she hadn't known she needed to fear until that very second. She turned toward the opening in the treehouse wall and looked down, where Jacob stood by the car, arms crossed, watching, but not smiling, not like before, not the way a friend would. Something in his posture had shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but to Ellen, it now felt like watching a mask fall just slightly, enough to glimpse the shape beneath. Chastity let out a low, uneasy growl, not loud, but enough to make Jacob glance toward the base of the tree and then look away just as quickly. Later, as they sat on a fallen log beneath the fading sky, Ellen gently placed the note in her lap and said nothing for a long while. Then, with the steady resolve of someone who has just taken the first full breath of her life, she looked Jacob in the eye and asked, "Who gave you permission to decide what parts of my life I should forget?" "I didn't decide anything, Ellen," Jacob said softly, his voice soaked in a kind of practiced calm that made you wonder what storm it was meant to cover. "I only did what I thought your husband would have wanted, after what happened to him." The moment he said those words, Ellen felt a coldness rise through her spine, not the kind that comes with weather or age, but the kind born from the sudden presence of a truth you didn't know you'd been kept from. She turned to him slowly, her eyes not angry, not yet, but searching, deep, deliberate, with the clarity of someone who's begun to gather the missing pieces of herself and doesn't want one more handed back bent out of shape. "You never told me he died," she said finally, the syllables landing one by one like leaves falling in the stillness after a storm. "Not once." Jacob looked away then, out toward the river, where the current moved steadily through the dusk like time itself refusing to stop, and he sighed, a long, rehearsed sigh that sounded more like preparation than regret. "Your mind was unraveling by the time I came back into your life," he said, his hands clasped too tightly in his lap, "and the doctors said the stress might accelerate it, so I left it alone." Ellen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes falling to Chastity, who had curled up at her feet in the same quiet patience she'd always carried, as if she too were holding the weight of this new truth in her paws. "I don't remember his face yet," Ellen murmured, not to Jacob, not even to herself, but to the wind or the trees or whatever part of the universe still listened when memory failed. Jacob said nothing, but his silence was thick, filled with the kind of restraint that suggested there was more he didn't dare say, not yet. That night, they didn't return to the care facility but instead stayed at a small inn on the outskirts of town, the kind with doilies on the dresser tops and wallpaper that smelled faintly of vanilla and thyme. Ellen sat in a chair by the window while the moon lit up her reflection in the glass, and for the first time in weeks, she recognized something in that image, not everything, not fully, but enough to keep holding on. She opened the box of letters from Mabel again and began sorting them by date, watching how the handwriting grew from shaky crayon lines to careful cursive, and then, toward the end, to rushed, anxious pen strokes. One letter stood out. It wasn't addressed in Annie's writing but in a firm, almost clinical hand, dated just weeks after Ellen's supposed disappearance. The words inside chilled her. "The estate transfer requires only your signature. Once she's declared unfit, the assets will move cleanly. Proceed carefully, she has friends who might ask questions." Ellen read that letter 3 times before folding it back into its envelope, her breath tight in her chest, the edge of the page still warm from her hands. She didn't say anything to Jacob that night, but something had shifted inside her again, some inner door that had remained closed out of fear or habit had creaked open, letting in a breeze that smelled like unfinished business. The next morning, Chastity led her to a familiar corner of the town square, a brick building with arched windows and a peeling sign above the door that read, Pine Hollow Church of Grace. Inside, the pews were dusted with sunlight and a piano sat quietly in the corner, as if waiting for someone to remember how to play it. The moment Ellen stepped through the doorway, an old man in a gray sweater looked up from a hymnal, and his eyes welled with tears that refused to fall. "Miss Ellen," he whispered, standing with effort but reverence, "you used to sing 'Abide with Me' here every Sunday without fail, even when the storm knocked the roof clear off." She didn't remember the song, but when he walked to the piano and gently placed her hands on the keys, her fingers knew what her mind did not, and the first notes rose like breath from deep within her chest. By the end of the second verse, she was weeping, not from the tune, but from the feeling that something sacred had returned to her, something bigger than memory, older than grief, something stitched into the very shape of her soul. Afterward, the old man brought her a small wooden box from behind the pulpit, one he said had been left there 5 years ago with her name scratched into the bottom. Inside was a silver chain, her wedding band suspended on it like a promise kept alive by hope, and a note written in her husband's handwriting, though faded with time, "If you forget me, let the music bring me back." Her knees nearly gave way beneath her, and Chastity was there, steady and solid, pressing close like an anchor in a sea that suddenly threatened to pull her under again. Jacob reached for the chain, saying something about taking it for safekeeping, but Ellen closed the box and held it to her chest without a word. She looked up at the stained glass window catching the light just right, casting a kaleidoscope of gold and blue across her hands, and she turned to Jacob with a voice like stone wrapped in silk. "Who else knows I'm alive?" she asked, not out of curiosity, but from the growing sense that someone, somewhere, had been watching and waiting for her to stay lost. "There's one man in town who knows," Jacob said slowly, his words drawing out like a match held to damp wood, careful and cautious, "but if he sees you again, Ellen, everything we've kept quiet might come crashing down." Ellen didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even ask what he meant by we, because in that moment, she already felt the walls of silence creaking with truths long overdue for daylight. They stood just outside the church, the late morning light filtering through the oaks like old secrets falling from the sky, and Chastity sat between them like a sentinel guarding something too sacred to name. "I want to see him," Ellen said at last, her voice low but firm, not loud like protest, but steady like water carving stone over time, sure and final. Jacob hesitated, glancing down the street as though afraid the mere mention of this man might summon him from some shadowed alleyway, then nodded, slowly, as though surrendering to a choice that had already been made for him. They walked in silence for a while, past the familiar curve of the diner where the waitresses still wore their hair in stiff curls and called every man sweetheart, until they reached a small building tucked behind a gas station, its windows dusty and its door painted the color of old pennies. The sign above read Anderson's Garage, and the name struck something loose inside Ellen's mind, something she couldn't quite see, but felt stirring like a train just beginning to rattle down the tracks. Jacob stayed by the car, claiming it was better if she went in alone, but Ellen noticed how he positioned himself just behind a lamppost, eyes fixed on the door like a man watching a pot that might boil over. Chastity led the way, nose low, tail straight, and as they entered the dimly lit shop, the scent of oil and rust wrapped around them like the past itself, strong, bitter, unchanging. At the far end of the room, bent over a vintage pickup with its hood yawning open like a tired mouth, stood a man in his 70s, his shoulders still broad, but his posture slightly stooped by either time or regret. "Ellen," he said without turning, and his voice landed like a hammer against her chest, not because it was loud, but because it was certain, like he'd been saying her name in his head for years and knew exactly how it would feel to finally speak it aloud. She took one slow step forward, her hand tightening on the leash, and asked, "Do I know you?" Though part of her already suspected the answer would change something permanent inside her. He wiped his hands on a rag, turned toward her, and she saw a face weathered by sunlight, grief, and too many hours spent waiting for someone who might never walk back through that door. "You should," he said gently, setting the rag aside. "You're the one who told me never to come to your house again, the day before you disappeared." Ellen's breath caught, and the memory flickered, not whole, not clear, but a feeling, a voice raised in panic, a slammed door, and the sound of rain. "I didn't disappear," she said, more to herself than to him. "Someone made me forget." The man nodded slowly, his eyes glancing through the cracked window toward Jacob still lingering near the sidewalk. "You told me something was wrong," he continued, his voice like gravel warmed by the sun. "Said your husband had discovered something, about the will, about the property, then the next morning, he was gone, and by evening, so were you." Ellen felt the ground shift slightly beneath her, as if the very foundation of her story had been poured in sand instead of stone. "My husband died in an accident," she whispered, though even as she said it, the words felt like someone else's, something handed to her and repeated until it sounded real. "Is that what he told you?" the mechanic asked, his voice soft, almost kind. "Because I found your husband's truck, parked half a mile from the river. No accident. No body. Just keys on the seat and blood on the steering wheel." Ellen closed her eyes, steadying herself on the counter, the sharp smell of motor oil anchoring her as her mind buckled under the weight of another truth too big to carry all at once. The man stepped closer, not threatening, just present, like he'd waited years for her to return, not so he could accuse her, but so she could finally hear the things no one else had dared say aloud. "He didn't drown," the man continued, quieter now. "He was meeting someone. I think he knew what was coming." Outside, Jacob shifted his weight, checking his watch, his eyes flitting nervously toward the shop door like he knew the story inside was beginning to fracture. Ellen looked up and met the man's gaze. "Why didn't you come forward?" she asked, voice trembling but determined. The man gave a slow, bitter smile. "I did, Ellen. I told the police. I told the attorney. But someone else said I was lying, said I had reason to discredit Jacob, said I was just jealous of the man who inherited everything when you were declared unfit to manage your own affairs. She took a breath then, not a deep one, but enough to steady the world just long enough to ask the one question she didn't yet know how to brace herself for. If I was never meant to forget, then who made sure I did? I don't know who gave the order, the mechanic said slowly, his eyes darkening with a kind of grief that never quite hardens into anger, but Jacob wasn't working alone. Those words hung in the air like smoke from a long-dead fire, curling into every corner of Ellen's mind, settling into the spaces where understanding had only begun to return. She stood there, surrounded by the scent of motor oil and old rubber, yet she felt like she was standing in a room she couldn't see, one built from betrayal, brick by brick, memory by stolen memory. Chastity sat quietly at her feet, not moving, not whining, simply watching the man's face the way dogs do when they sense something in a person that people often miss. Ellen's hands, still trembling slightly, clutched the silver locket that now hung from a thin chain around her neck, as though its presence might shield her from what was coming next. Then who was it? She asked, her voice low but edged with something sharper now, something shaped more like resolve than fear. The mechanic shook his head, slowly, like someone replaying 1,000 moments and realizing how many of them had been out of tune. I can't tell you for certain, he said, choosing each word like it might matter 50 years from now, but your name didn't vanish from the town records by accident, Ellen. The day after your husband disappeared, the bank suddenly froze your accounts, and a doctor who'd never treated you declared you medically unstable. Ellen's breath caught in her throat, the air suddenly thick with the realization that what had happened to her hadn't been the result of time or illness, but orchestration. Who filed the medical documents? She asked, although the answer was already beginning to take shape in her mind, like a shadow stepping out into the light. He hesitated, then moved to an old filing cabinet in the corner, pulling out a yellowed envelope that he had no right to possess, but had kept anyway, as though part of him always knew this day would come. Inside was a copy of a letter, signed by a name Ellen didn't recognize, but co-signed by someone she did, the attorney who handled her late husband's affairs, a man named Dorsey Clay. And in the margin, barely legible in pencil, were the words, Jacob to collect deed on Monday. The room fell silent again, except for the soft whir of an overhead fan that had long since given up trying to move the summer air. Ellen looked down at the page, her eyes scanning the dates, the language, the cruelty of bureaucracy dressed up in concern, and she felt her hands curl into themselves, not in rage, but in sorrow so deep it wrapped around her like a shawl. They made me a ghost, she whispered, and her voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the terrible power of realization, because once you see how you disappeared, you cannot pretend to be invisible again. The mechanic nodded solemnly, then reached into the drawer again and pulled out a small envelope with Ellen's name on it, one he said had arrived at the shop 4 years ago but was never delivered. Inside was a child's drawing, simple, bright, joyful, a stick-figure woman with a cane and a dog beside her, walking toward a house with a heart drawn above the door. In the corner, in bright purple crayon, were the words, Dear Miss Ellen, I still believe you're out there. Come home soon. Love, Annie. Ellen pressed the picture to her chest, her eyes brimming with a grief she didn't know how to carry, because it didn't belong to just her, it belonged to the people who had waited, wondered, and never stopped hoping. Outside, Jacob had moved closer to the garage door, his posture tight, his smile long gone, his eyes now flickering not with concern, but calculation. I need to find her, Ellen said suddenly, folding the drawing and slipping it gently into her coat pocket. I need to see Annie. I need to tell her I didn't leave her on purpose. The mechanic placed a steady hand on her shoulder, offering support without asking permission, and nodded slowly. You'll find her, Miss Ellen. She never stopped drawing maps in the mail, just hoped one would reach you someday. As she stepped back outside, the light had changed, softer now, golden and forgiving, like the town itself was beginning to remember her. Jacob stepped forward, smile returning with a strain that made it brittle around the edges. You look tired, he said, his voice coated in honey. Let's get you back to the home. All this digging into the past, maybe it's too much too fast. But Ellen didn't answer right away. She stared at him, long and hard, not in accusation, but as if trying to see beyond the face he wore for the world. Then, almost gently, she asked, "Jacob, where were you the night my husband disappeared?" "I was exactly where he told me to be, and if you don't believe that, Ellen, maybe you should ask your sister," Jacob said, his voice sliding across the late afternoon quiet like a stone skimming water, leaving ripples that widened into places neither of them had dared search before now. Ellen felt the words settle on her shoulders with the heavy familiarity of an old winter coat, the kind you tuck away in the attic for years and then discover still carries the scent of wood smoke and storms, reminding you of evenings spent wondering whether the roof would hold. The mention of her sister, quiet, distant, half lost in the fog of forgotten years, unlatched a door in Ellen's mind, swinging it open to reveal not memories exactly, but snapshots, a shared quilt on a childhood porch, a whispered promise beneath 4th of July fireworks, and one argument so sharp it split the years between them like broken glass. Chastity, sensing the tremor in Ellen's silence, pressed close enough for her warmth to bleed through denim and into Ellen's bones, offering the uncomplicated loyalty only a dog can give when the human world starts speaking in riddles and threats. Jacob's eyes softened, though the softness felt practiced, as if he'd worn that expression so often it had become a mask stitched to his very skin, and he suggested they go somewhere quieter to discuss family matters, away from the echoing clang of wrenches and diesel fumes. Ellen followed him outside, though every step felt like stepping onto a sheet of thin ice, that brittle tension spreading beneath her feet with each breath she took, as the mechanic watched from the garage doorway, arms folded, gaze heavy with unvoiced caution. They drove north along the river road, the landscape unfurling in rolling chords of late summer green that might have been beautiful if not for the way suspicion turned every mile marker into a question Ellen wasn't yet strong enough to answer. Jacob explained that after her husband disappeared, her sister Lydia was the only blood relative who answered the lawyer's calls, signing forms that placed Ellen's care, and the estate, under Jacob's supervision, for the sake of stability, a phrase so neat it almost sounded merciful until you tasted the metallic aftertaste of greed behind it. Ellen listened, one hand on Chastity's collar, the other clutching the locket where her wedding band now rested, each bump in the road knocking memory fragments loose, letting them clatter through her thoughts like marbles spilled across a hardwood floor. They pulled into a modest white farmhouse that slouched beneath a stand of maples, the paint chipped, the porch rail sagging, yet there was still a neatness in the flower beds and a welcome mat that read, "Come on in," with the optimism of someone who hadn't changed it in years. Jacob waited by the mailbox while Ellen and Chastity climbed the steps, the dog's nails tapping out a rhythm of quiet urgency, and Ellen knocked on the door that had once been familiar though now felt as foreign as a stranger's confession. The door opened to reveal Lydia, but not the bright-eyed girl of Ellen's fading snapshots. This was a woman stooped not by age alone, but by secrets carried too long, her hair silvered and her eyes a stormy gray that searched Ellen's face like someone peering through fog for the shoreline they'd lost. For a heartbeat, neither sister spoke, the years of silence stretching between them like a taut rope, until Lydia's voice broke, soft and jagged, "They told me you'd never come back, that remembering would only hurt us both." Ellen stepped inside, inhaling the faint scent of lilac soap that stirred echoes of Sunday baths and clothesline summers, and she felt a tear creep down her cheek, not for the time lost, but for the moments stolen by decisions she never got to make. They sat at the kitchen table where a single-place setting remained, as though Lydia still expected an absent guest, and Lydia poured tea with shaking hands, each clink of china punctuating truths that had waited too long to be heard. Lydia confessed that Jacob had come with legal papers and gentle reassurances, promising Ellen would receive the best care if they transferred the estate quickly, because financial instability might impede her recovery, and Lydia, scared and alone, signed where she was told, trusting the man who claimed devotion beyond friendship. Ellen listened without interrupting, except to stroke Chastity's fur whenever anger threatened to outrun compassion, reminding herself that forgiveness and justice often travel the same road, though at very different speeds. Then Lydia opened a narrow drawer and withdrew a sealed envelope, edges yellowed, marked, "To be opened when Ellen is safe," her name written in their mother's handwriting, delicate but certain, like someone sewing hope into paper. Inside lay a single page from their mother, dated 2 weeks before her death, warning that the family lands were worth more than anyone realized and urging Lydia to safeguard Ellen's share, because some friends measure love in dollars when grief leaves the door unlocked. Ellen's fingers trembled across the signature, each loop in the ink a quiet testament that even the dying can see treachery when the living choose not to, and she felt a fresh wave of anger crest, then recede into sorrow too deep for words. Before she could find her voice, headlights swept across the kitchen window, Jacob's car turning down the driveway again, though he had claimed he would stay by the road to give the sisters privacy, a lie now glowing in the low beam of halogen light. Chastity stood, hackles lifting, the dog's low rumble slicing through the tick of the wall clock, and Lydia gripped Ellen's hand, whispering, "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was protecting myself." Ellen squeezed back, choosing tenderness over blame, yet her gaze remained fixed on the shadow crossing the yard, a silhouette walking slowly but deliberately toward the porch steps, like a man convinced the story would end exactly as he'd written it. She rose, voice steady despite the tremor in her knees, and said to Lydia, "We'll face him together, no more papers signed in fear, no more truths whispered behind locked doors." Lydia nodded, tears swimming in her eyes, and with a courage sharpened by regret, she asked, "Ellen, after everything he's taken, how do we make sure Jacob never steals another day from you?" Ellen drew a steady breath, letting the silence curve around her thoughts like the rim of a trusted cup, and answered Lydia with a voice so calm it sounded almost distant, saying they would begin by shining light on every shadow Jacob had carefully arranged, because nothing weakens deceit faster than a crowd of honest witnesses who finally understand the story they are standing inside. She explained that the mechanic's testimony, combined with their mother's letter and Annie's postcards, formed a chain of evidence strong enough to hold a grand jury's attention, provided they moved swiftly before Jacob could weave another blanket of paperwork to smother the truth beneath signatures and seals. Chastity's low growl drifted through the room like distant thunder just as Jacob stepped onto the porch, and Ellen told Lydia to keep the front door open wide, since evil prefers narrow hallways where it can whisper rather than open verandas where every neighbor can see what's unfolding. When Jacob entered the kitchen, carrying that polished smile which had once passed for kindness, Ellen met him halfway across the faded linoleum, locket glinting against her chest like a lighthouse beacon announcing land to a ship that never planned to dock. She spoke first, her words deliberate and unhurried, explaining that she had retrieved copies of the medical declaration bearing a forged physician's stamp, as well as banking files showing sudden transfers into an account opened under an alias he'd used in college, which was something he probably assumed no one living would remember. Jacob's lips twitched, not quite forming surprise, not quite forming denial, and he countered that every signature on those documents existed because Ellen's mental state made guardianship essential, a claim that might have carried weight if Chastity hadn't, at that precise moment, nosed a manila envelope from his coat pocket, its torn edge revealing the original deed to Ellen's property still bearing wet fingerprints. Lydia gasped, realizing the document was dated only a week earlier, meaning Jacob had planned to complete the transfer now that Ellen's reappearance threatened the carefully balanced timeline he'd nurtured, and her shock seemed to shake loose a bravery that had slumbered beneath guilt for far too many years. She turned on Jacob with a fierceness born of wasted time, something he clearly hadn't expected from the sister he once convinced with stale coffee and legalese, and she demanded to know who else sat at the table where her sister's life had been carved into pieces small enough to pass unnoticed. Jacob's gaze flicked toward the darkness beyond the kitchen window, as if searching for rescue among the maples, but found only branches scraping glass like fingernails reminding him that every tree keeps a record of storms it has survived. Ellen unfolded her mother's letter in both trembling hands, reading aloud the warning about friends measuring love in dollars, and as each sentence filled the room Jacob's shoulders sagged, every word stripping away a layer of the persona he'd so carefully ironed and starched for public presentation. In that vulnerable hush, Chastity moved between them, her presence an unspoken reminder of loyalty unbought, and Ellen told Jacob she would be visiting Sheriff Holcomb first thing in the morning, armed with letters, deeds, and witness statements ready to reopen a case officially closed before anyone had bothered to confirm whether the body in question even existed. Unexpectedly, Jacob's calm shattered, his voice rose, brittle as cracked porcelain, insisting that reopening the investigation would ruin reputations, fracture families, and reveal an uglier truth about Ellen's husband than she was prepared to face, though he refused to detail what that ugliness might be. Lydia stepped closer to Ellen, gripping her sister's arm, and declared that reputations built on fraud deserved ruin, while families already fractured by lies could only be healed by daylight, and Jacob's face paled as he realized the sisters now stood together like bookends he could no longer push apart. Just then, tires crunched on the gravel drive, and through the window they saw headlights sweeping across the yard at an hour few casual visitors would choose, prompting Jacob to mutter a single name, Clay, before the engine cut off and silence settled like dust after demolition. Ellen felt her pulse hammer, recognizing the attorney's surname as the one scrawled beside Jacob's in the forged paperwork, and she understood that whatever conversation approached would either cement their case or bury the truth deeper beneath new layers of intimidation. She whispered to Lydia to dial the mechanic and ask him to bring the sheriff immediately, because evidence tends to speak louder when the law arrives before anyone has time to trim its sentences, and Lydia nodded, fingers already trembling over the keypad. Footsteps echoed on the porch, slow, measured, unhurried, and Jacob's expression morphed from panic to calculation, as if he still believed he could negotiate the terms of exposure provided he controlled the next 5 minutes of the script he'd written long ago. Ellen squared her shoulders, feeling the weight of every recovered memory settle into place like stones forming a foundation, and she wondered, just for a heartbeat, whether the final truth waiting beyond that door would heal her or break her, yet knowing she had no choice but to hear it. Clay's knuckles rapped against the screen door once, sharp, authoritative, impatient, and Ellen turned to Jacob, voice low but steady, asking the question that would decide whether he still held even a shred of decency. Jacob, before I let him inside, will you finally tell me what really happened beside the river the night my husband vanished? Jacob inhaled as though the air itself weighed more than his lungs could bear, and when he finally spoke, his confession poured out in a single, low-voiced river of words, explaining that her husband, Noah, had uncovered forged documents transferring the ancestral land into a shell company fronted by Clay, and on the night beside the river he had summoned Jacob, demanding that every crooked page be burned before sunrise, threatening to walk into town and expose the conspiracy that very hour if Jacob refused. His voice shook when he admitted that tempers rose sharper than the cicadas in the trees, that Noah's fury eclipsed the moonlit water, and in a desperate flash of panic Jacob tried to seize the stack of deeds, causing Noah to stumble backward on the slick embankment where he struck his head, falling silent in the reeds while a dark stain spread through his hair, yet Noah's pulse still fluttered when Jacob knelt beside him, afraid, ashamed, and horribly aware that a living witness could unravel everything Clay had promised would soon be irrevocably his. Clay rapped again at the door, each knock a reminder that the past was now sprinting alongside the present, and Jacob's eyes darted toward the porch as he confessed that Clay ordered him, by phone, to let the river finish the paperwork, promising they would declare Noah missing, then file for guardianship over Ellen while her grief and failing memory could be molded into compliance. A plan so coldly efficient it froze even Jacob's conscience, yet he obeyed, pushing the barely breathing man onto a driftwood log and watching him slip away into the current like a leaf surrendering to the tide. Ellen gripped the kitchen chair, her knuckles white, as Lydia covered her mouth in disbelief, and Chastity growled deep in her throat, sensing the swell of heartbreak filling the tiny room where lilac-scented memories now twisted with the metallic sting of betrayal, while outside Clay finally tired of waiting and shouldered through the screen, his polished shoes clicking against the worn floorboards with the confidence of a man who has long mistaken paperwork for power. Clay surveyed the scene, Jacob's wilted posture, Ellen's tear-filled stare, Lydia clutching a phone that already buzzed with Sheriff Holcomb's muffled assurances on the line, yet he still smiled the thin smile of someone convinced that law bends in the hands of those bold enough to twist it, and he began a speech about misunderstanding, mental fragility, and the burdens of caretaking that only men of character could bear. But his words faltered when Chastity moved between him and Ellen, hackles raised, amber eyes locked on Clay's silk tie now trembling slightly with each heartbeat. Jacob, crumbling at last, whispered that Clay had promised there would be no blood, only signatures, and that Ellen's memory would fade quietly, leaving them free to divide the estate like scavengers at an unmarked feast. The attorney's composure cracked as Lydia read aloud their mother's letter, her voice steady despite tears, while Ellen held up the manila envelope freshly fallen from Jacob's coat, exposing the deed he had tried to shuffle into his jacket when Chastity nosed it loose, and in that moment the house seemed to breathe, every creaking timber bearing witness to a decade of deception finally dragged into daylight. Sirens wailed in the distance, a mournful yet righteous sound drawing closer, and Clay turned to flee only to find the mechanic's pickup blocking the driveway, Sheriff Holcomb's cruiser close behind, their headlights washing the maples in harsh white honesty. Realizing the end had arrived, Clay pushed past Ellen toward the back door, but Jacob, shaking violently, grabbed his arm and declared he was done running, that he would testify and name every accomplice if Clay forced him to choose between freedom and a soul already bruised beyond recognition. The sheriff escorted both men to the patrol car without struggle, their cuffed wrists reflecting porch light in dull glints that felt less like justice served and more like lives wasted on greed, while Ellen, shoulders trembling, walked onto the grass where the night air smelled of damp earth and wild mint, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by blank spaces but by chapters she would write on her own terms. Holcomb returned from the cruiser, removing his hat with a gentleness reserved for funerals and births, and told Ellen that divers would be sent at dawn to search the silted bends downstream, because every story deserved a body, or a miracle, and he promised nothing except that truth rarely stayed buried once love started digging. Dawn slipped softly over the river valley like a curtain lifting, and Ellen stood on the dew-slick grass with Lydia and Chastity, the dog's tail brushing her calf in quiet reassurance as searchlights bobbed upon the water. Minutes stretched into hours until a shout rose from the reeds, drawing everyone to the bank where a diver emerged holding a tarnished wedding ring matching the one in Ellen's locket and a waterproof field journal wrapped in oilskin, its pages miraculously dry despite years. Beneath shifting mud. Inside the journal, Noah's final entries revealed he had uncovered the fraud weeks earlier, feared violence, and planned to fake his own disappearance long enough to gather proof, but the last page, dated the night he met Jacob, ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing like a life interrupted yet not extinguished, and below that, a jagged line smudged by water that might have been one final attempt to write Ellen's name. Ellen pressed the journal to her heart, tears sliding freely, not only for the man she had loved but for the years she had been forced to grieve without knowing what sorrow she carried, and as the sheriff laid a hand on her shoulder, Chastity lifted her muzzle to the brightening sky and released a low, melodic howl that seemed less mourning than declaration, an ancient sound reminding everyone present that loyalty stretches beyond memory, beyond time, beyond even death. Weeks passed, and the courthouse filled with testimonies, exhibits, and the quiet determination of a community confronting its own capacity for both kindness and corruption. Jacob, pale and contrite, detailed every transaction, implicating Clay and the false physician in exchange for a sentence he knew would still see him behind bars long after sunsets no longer looked like spilled wine. On the final day of proceedings, Ellen took the stand, her voice steady as a hymn, and she spoke not of revenge but of restoration, describing nights when silence felt louder than thunder and mornings when Chastity's gentle nudge pushed her toward a future her mind no longer recognized. She told the court that memory can be stolen, but the soul remembers, and sometimes a dog, a song, or a child's crayon map can lead you back to yourself even after the world decides you are lost for good. The judge, moved by her grace, ordered the estate returned, funds replenished with penalties, and scholarships established for local children in Noah's name, so the land that once grew wheat and worry would now grow opportunity for generations yet unborn. Ellen thanked the court, then stepped into the hallway where reporters waited, choosing only one statement to offer: never underestimate the power of a story unfinished. Later that evening, under the slow-turning ceiling fan of Lydia's porch, Ellen opened Noah's journal again, this time reading him not as a relic but as a companion, each entry a bridge across 10 missing years, and when she reached the unfinished sentence, she lifted her pen and completed it with the words Noah surely intended: Ellen, love remembers. Chastity rested her head on Ellen's knee, sighing as though satisfied the journey was complete, and Annie, now a young woman with tears shining in her eyes, sat beside them, pressing a fresh drawing into Ellen's palm, one that showed a house, a treehouse, a river, and 3 figures standing together beneath a sky overflowing with stars. Ellen closed her eyes, letting the evening settle around her like a quilt stitched from reclaimed memories, and she whispered a promise to the warm night, that tomorrow she would walk the library aisles again, would sing, "Abide with Me," beneath the patch-repaired church roof, would visit the mechanic's garage to thank him for faithfulness, and would start planting sunflowers where the river once swallowed secrets, because life, she now understood, isn't about erasing pain but about sowing beauty in the places pain has been. And as crickets began their twilight chorus, Lydia asked quietly if Ellen was sure the town would accept her after all the rumors, all the years, all the grief, and Ellen smiled, her heart finally steady, her voice rich with the certainty of dawn. "They will, sister, because the story isn't broken anymore, and everyone loves a tale that finds its way home." Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.